Super. Got sound. I've got a clock here, so and it also tells me it's 73 degrees Fahrenheit in here. So we're more people. We're nice and warm, but we'll get started on time. My name's David Pashley, and I want to talk to you about the EU Cyber Resilience Act. And the nature of my talk is to explain about the Act and then draw some conclusions. But from the conversations I've been having with people this morning, I'm not going to do the whole show of hands thing, but I do get the impression most people are interested in the Cyber Resilience Act in terms of learning what it's about. So I'm going to major on that, and then sort of a few slides at the end, and I'll draw my conclusions about it. So, just not quite starting till everybody, one or two people. It is 13:20. One final person just coming in. So yes, let's crack on then. The title of the talk is "Will the EU CRA shake up OS and hardware choices?" And the reason I've chose that is that my company, which I'll say a little bit more about at the end, I'm not going to do company slides and stuff, at least not at the beginning. We're interested in the EU CRA and helping our customers to comply. We're also interested in OS choice because one of the things we do in the projects that we encounter in our professional lives is we work on Linux, embedded Linux, but we also work with the commercial OS, QNX. RTOS, I should say. They like to call it an RTOS, QNX. And we also work with customers on hardware choices. So those are three things that sort of exercise me every day. So I'm sort of bringing them together in this particular talk. But as I said, I think I'm going to bring it round a little bit to try and be more of a short CRA explainer, partly because I'm not very good at this whole short CRA explainer thing. Here's the agenda, and it says the EU CRA in 5-ish minutes. Well, okay, that might be 10 or 15 minutes, but that's sort of the quickest I can do. Somebody came to me this morning with a video camera and said, explain the EU CRA in 1 minute, and it was a car crash. So So that's going to be the main thing we talk about. And then the other things I just wanted to sort of add on at the end was I want to talk about what the CRA says about open source, because nobody talks about that, and it's quite important because most of us here will be using open source. If nothing else, our operating system might be Linux or it might be FreeRTOS. Those are common choices, so that affects us. At the same time, what, if anything, does the CRA say about commercial operating systems? And then, in that domain, who takes responsibility for CRA compliance? Let's talk about that. And this whole thing about the burden of compliance, or you might consider it, I hope you do, the opportunity of compliance. How does that whole thing maybe change our outlook as embedded? I'm an embedded design engineer, that's my background, and I imagine a lot of you are as well. How might that change our outlook? So, CRA in 5 or perhaps a few more minutes. On December the 11th, 2024, the EU Cyber Resilience Act entered into law. And Article 69(2) said that all products with digital elements within scope, we'll say what the scope is in a minute, shipped to customers from 36 months. So in other words, December the 11th, 2027, anything you ship to customers from that date, if you want it to have a CE mark, and you want to be legally allowed to affix a CE mark, you must comply with the CRA. There are penalties within the CRA if you don't, but the most important penalty is that you're committing fraud, obviously, if you attach the CE mark and you don't comply. So it's quite an important thing, and there are ways in which that deadline moves forward as well, which I'll explain a little about during the talk. So what is the scope? The CRA applies to all products with digital elements which are not covered by other regulation, like medical, automotive, defence. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list. Note the little asterisk at the end. We're about to come to that. the purpose or use of which includes a direct or indirect logical or physical connection to a device or network. So obviously anything internet connected is in there, but at the other end of the spectrum, something with a USB port. The purpose of the USB port is to connect to something. I even had somebody after one of these talks saying, what if I hide the USB port? I said, well, if you're hiding it, you're still putting it there for a purpose. So if you need to put it there, you need to comply because the purpose is to connect to something. So anything that connects to something brings you within scope of the CRA. I don't care if it's an RS-232 port that's sort of half hidden inside anything. You are still subject to the provisions of the CRA. By the way, operating systems and processors are also included as products with digital elements. So I'll mention that, touch on that a bit more later. And the asterisk is but. Anything with a radio, with wireless connectivity, is also subject to the cybersecurity requirements of what we're referring to as RED 2. RED is the Radio Equipment Directive, and that has been amended, a general amendment to add some cybersecurity requirements, which is sort of broadly in line with the CRA. We'll come to that. So the requirements of the CRA, I break them down into 8, which is why I've got 7 blobs on the screen. Sorry about that. It will change as we go on. Now, I haven't got time in 5 minutes, or what will perhaps come a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but I still haven't got time to go into the various requirements, but I can tell you what they are. And the first requirement is that you must perform a risk assessment, and that is sort of the upfront requirement. The risk assessment is starting with a process called threat modeling, where you look at basically what could go wrong. If you're looking at an existing piece of, well, the risk assessment then looks at the various stipulations of the CRA and sort of says, well, where are we with each of those? If it's an existing piece of equipment, you can then go on to perform a gap analysis and see where you're short. But the important thing about the risk assessment and why it is the most important provision of the CRA is that the CRA says that all the other things, well, nearly all the other stipulations that I'm about to enumerate are subject to the risk assessment. So if the risk assessment says you don't need something and you can justify that, just maybe you can do without it. So remember that, and remember that's why the risk assessment is important. Next, you need to implement a secure software development life cycle. I've always been a bit of a hardware guy, although I have done my share of software development. If I was in your shoes, this would be something somebody else was about to have to worry about. But you have a software development life cycle. You need to completely start from scratch and implement a secure version of it. And there are a couple of well-known texts that describe how you might go about this. If you've heard of CWE's common weaknesses and enumerations, excuse me, I need my water. These are the programming flaws, if you like, which mean that you can then, by implementing these flaws, you can then have software which is subject to safety and security failures. In cybersecurity terms, easier to attack. So you need to have a method of avoiding all these CWEs. You'll need things like static analysis in there, and whatever your team approach is to your SDL, agile, whatever, you'll need to completely adapt that to the already documented and discussed secure version. You need to ensure data confidentiality, and it says in the CRA that you need to do this by encrypting data both in transit and at rest. So that's quite a big job in itself. Let's take, though, an example. Let's say you're choosing, we're thinking about a lift controller, and you're choosing whether to go to floor 1 or floor 2. Does that information really need to be encrypted? Well, no, clearly it doesn't. That would be ludicrous. And that's where your risk assessment comes in and says, well, wait a minute, this data has absolutely no value to it in terms of cybersecurity context. Therefore, we don't need to do that. What if in the lift, attached to your lift controller, there is a video camera? Well, now you've got personally identifiable data. You know that an identifiable person selected a certain floor at a certain time. GDPR applies, and now you must have encryption because you must protect that. So that's just the sort of trade-offs you're making there. Probably the most demanding, technically demanding, from a software standpoint, requirement of the CRA is that you must ship your product without exploitable vulnerabilities. So how do you go about that? Well, you have to take a SBOM, a software bill of materials of your software. You have to perform a software composition analysis, which will list all the CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, which are documented in various databases. You need to list all those, and then you need to decide how you're going to justify, and there'll be hundreds of them, by the way. You need to decide how you are going to argue that they don't apply to your particular implementation, or you need to decide how you're going to mitigate them and document how you are applying those mitigations. So that's a big task. You need to prevent unauthorized access by some means of authentication, because the CRA says that it must not be possible for either the configuration information, i.e. the firmware, or the data held within your device to be compromised. So the most obvious way to do that, although arguably this isn't compulsory, but I think for most situations it will actually prove to be the only sensible way forward. You need to implement secure boot. Secure boot means that you have a hardware root of trust, and the hardware root of trust, say in your processor, will say we will only execute an image which is signed according to the public key that we're holding. So if it will only execute a signed image, you know it's your image and cannot be compromised. One reason why that is very likely to prove something that you must definitely do is that you also have an obligation to provide free security updates for the lifetime of your product. So as you become aware of new CVEs, and you are also under a duty to regularly monitor for CVEs, as you become aware of new ones, you must provide updates, and the updates must be free of charge to the end user, which effectively means there will be OTA or OTW updates, because you can't be shipping out SD cards or whatever. So you will need a whole mechanism for that. Not finally. There's an eighth thing. You need to commit to secure manufacture. It's all very well doing these things and then sending your design files off to some CEM in another continent. But you need some way of controlling or effectively extending the reach of your secure environment to make sure that that manufacture conforms with all the good security stuff you've done beforehand. That turns out not to be incredibly straightforward. Finally, you need to document all this. And the documentation, sorry, I'm holding that like I'm an Australian drinking beer. The documentation has to include your declaration of conformity, which has to take each individual provision of the Cyber Resilience Act and explain how you meet it, and also include your risk assessment and all that stuff. So those are the requirements of the CRA. For you, you're probably asking yourself, okay, that's a thing. What do I need to do now? Well, where would I start? And there are various answers to that, and I'm going to sort of give you some of those. It's all a matter of opinion, okay? But my opinion is that free security updates and the secure boot thing are things that you need to do up front. Why? Because those are at the level where you might feasibly not be able to implement them without a hardware decision being made. And the hardware decision is really the most difficult in terms of the lead time from there on. In other words, sorry, I'm labouring the point, but these are decisions they're things you need to decide how you're going to do early on. So they're the things that you should be thinking about now. You should also be thinking about the whole ship without vulnerability things, because it just turns out to be quite a big task. And some people say you will never quite meet that objective, but that's not the point. The point is that you've got to show the rationale for how you have made your best stab at that. And also the risk assessment, because as I said, what's the point of other things without the risk assessment? Because if your product is incredibly non-controversial, non-attackable, non-target worthy, you might be able to make some arguments to mitigate some of the requirements. Okay, so I'm saying right now, but do you remember I mentioned earlier about RED, the Radio Equipment Directive? Well, the CRA interacts with, or should say the other way around, what we've come to call RED 2, the Delegated Act on Cybersecurity, as implemented in a standard called the EN 18031. This interacts, excuse me, this interacts with the CRA. How does it interact? Well, it basically says, just to cut to the chase, if you've got a wireless interface, you must comply by August 25. Okay, so if your product has a wireless interface, from August 2025, you must not put a CE mark on it or ship it to Europe, because you'll be doing a fraudulent thing, because the CE mark means that you're compliant with EU regulations, and the EU regulation says that. So it's like a subset of CRA. It's not actually doesn't actually have the full force of all the CRA cybersecurity requirements. And also it disappears in June 28, exactly 6 months after the CRA enters force, because it's recognised by the EU that the CRA requirements are a superset, so what's the point having it? We'll have duplication, let's get rid of it. So, how does that change? Well, change our little matrix. Well, the things I put red round are all the things that the RED 2 says you must do. So it sort of brings up the wagon to right now for those things. So that makes our matrix end up looking like this. I would say, just sort of concluding this whole little subsection, quite big subsection about the CRA, I would say that if you're going to do one thing, it's not any of this stuff. It is actually to go back to your company and say, I, or somebody in my company, needs to be the CRA guy or girl. You need somebody who has their head around this stuff so that you can formulate a plan. Knowledge is power. So I know it's a shameless plug, but hey, that's what I'm there for. We are giving training on the Cyber Resilience Act in June in the UK, in person, in Oxfordshire. If you fancy coming, pick up one of these. There's actually 15% off with a code on there. So, if you do nothing else, equip yourself, go back to your company. Maybe you have managers to convince, make it their problem. At the end of the day, somebody's got to take that decision. Do we put the CE mark on or not? Okay, let's just change the subject totally now. That's my little CRA explainer. Just add a few other topics that I want to make some observations on. Just really to make this presentation a little bit different from the usual, just let's explain about CRA. Let's talk about CRA and open source. What does CRA say about open source? Does it mention? Yes, it says a lot about it. It goes on and on about it. So we should know about that. It defines the role of an open source steward. Because if you think about it, open source, by definition, people are designing stuff which is available for free. They're making it available for free. If you didn't define a special role for them, they'd be making something available for free that they have to pay a lot of money to make compliant, because it's a product with, I've already mentioned, an operating system, for example, is a product with digital elements. So we've got this special role of the open source steward, and the open source steward is not accountable for CRA compliance. As long as their employer, if they're a person, they might be an entity, or them, if they are an entity, as long as they are not using that open source stuff in a product for commercial gain. If they are, then they are subject to the provisions of the CRA. So the entity using the software for the commercial purpose, at the end of the day, is responsible for ensuring compliance, but generally this won't be an open source steward. An open source steward might, companies like ARM employ a shed load of Linux developers, and they can go ahead with their Linux development as open source stewards because all they're doing is making the ARM Linux stuff available. And so that's okay. So that's what the CRA says about open source. What does it say about operating systems in general? Well, I've already mentioned it quite directly says that operating systems, notwithstanding what I've just said, must comply with the CRA. Also expect them to be CE marked. Interesting. It also says they're an important class 1 product with digital elements. The CRA actually has 4 different levels of strictness, if you like, in terms of the hoops you must jump through to show compliance, because at the lowest level, most products can self-certify, which is a good thing. So that's general. You have important class 1, important class 2, and critical. So operating systems are at the not at the low level. They have enhanced compliance requirements. What about processors and boards? Well, they must comply too. And it says microcontrollers and microprocessors are, again, important class 1 products. But let's be clear about this. Choosing a processor, which has probably had to go through huge strictures internally to be compliant, you choose the processor, then you bring open source software onto it. That doesn't mean that that open source software is the responsibility of the processor vendor, because it's open source and because of the things I've just said. So because the processor, when you get a processor, it doesn't say, and you must use this software. No, it says, and you may use this software, which is completely different. Means that the processor vendor isn't directly responsible for the compliance of that software. Same thing sort of applies to COTS boards, although they're boards and module vendors are sort of flying a bit close to the wind, because they sort of say, here's the BSP that you have to use, and okay, it's open source, but it is specific to our hardware. So there's some discussion about that, but what you will see is some board vendors make a huge effort to make sure everything is compliant. Other board vendors, it's not us. You could use some other software, or you don't even have to, just make your own choices. And it's a bit of a cop-out, but we're seeing both people going both ways. But what I'd say is important is don't shove that onto the poor old board vendor. Don't say, well, you have to be responsible for compliance, because one thing you don't want to do at any point when you're creating a CRA compliant product is to be completely hemmed in. Okay, there will be a way of ensuring compliance for whatever is out there that you want to use. And the important question that you should be asking board vendors is not, is there a CE mark on that? And if not, when will there be? Although you could quite reasonably ask that. It should be, what are you doing about vulnerabilities in the image that you're using, that you're showing me on that board? What are you doing? Are you even thinking about it? Do you have a facility for secure boot? If I were to use your product and I wanted to do OTA updating, do you have something off the shelf that I could use for that? Or will we be scratching our heads and wondering where to begin? These are the important questions. So, open source questions. Who takes responsibility for Linux compliance? Is it the OSS, the open source steward who is developing Linux? What about the Linux Foundation, actually? That's an interesting question. Linux is open source, but there's an organization called the Linux Foundation, which is actually doing great work, including on cyber resilience. They have a number of projects. One of their projects is called the Yocto project. You will have heard of that quite likely. Another of their projects is called the OSSF, the Open Source Security Foundation. The Open Source Security Foundation has taken the role of the mothership for the open source stewards. So they recently did a survey of the open source stewards, interesting. And they published it in a report. So as you can see, it's not looking very optimistic, because they entitled the report Unaware and Uncertain. And this was in March 25, so quite recent. And I picked out a few highlights. 51% of open source stewards are uncertain about CRA deadlines. And only 28% could identify 2027 as when they need to be compliant. Well, they don't need to be compliant, do they? But when their users of their software need to be compliant. And they said that financial support, legal guidance, and technical resources are all lacking in terms of their ability to meet CRA requirements. So, just interesting. Processor or board vendor, we've already mentioned that. What about a third party? Yeah, there are already third parties out there saying, you know, we'll help you with CRA compliance. The OEM product developer, who I take to be the audience here. Well, Linux developer, Linux Foundation, processor vendor, in terms of their product, obviously compliant, but in terms of the software you choose to use, they will help you according to their best efforts. Board vendor, third party, yeah, they'll help you, but one way or another, there'll be a cost involved. If the board vendor is saying, well, we have compliant boards, they will be somehow charging more for those boards. If a third party offers to help you with CRA compliance, they'll probably want to chuck out all the software you're using, probably all the hardware you're using, and say, well, we like to use this because we've already done our thing on it. So for a substantial sum of money, we'll adapt your product to use this hardware and software. Unfortunately, it's the OEM product developer where the buck stops, because that's what the law says. It says that the person making the commercial product is the entity responsible for compliance. Running out of time, but very quick sort of side argument here, complete change of topic. Just remind ourselves why most embedded products use Linux. And I'm not going to discuss these much because I'm running out of time. I'm going to put them up. A lot of people think no tools licensing costs, no runtime licensing costs. This is why we use it. It's not. And those of you who use Linux know very well that's not true, which is why when people say, oh, look, I've got this other thing and it's for money, but the lifetime cost of Linux is huge, you're not persuaded by that argument. It's all to do with know-how and experience and the fact that any hardware that is Linux capable, in other words, any processor with an MMU, will have full Linux support, not just for the processor, but for every single item of connectivity that exists in the world that could connect, that is on the system on chip, or could be connected to that processor, and the huge software ecosystem. So that's why we choose Linux. Why do some people choose a commercial OS or RTOS? Commercially delivered tech support, yeah, that's nice. Commercial grade tools, nice to have. Commercial liability for IP is actually quite an important thing, because when you ship a Linux product, you know, who the hell is saying that you really have ownership of all those bits that you're including? But the real reasons are things that Linux can't do. Actually, hard real-time can't do very well. Functional safety compliance to the highest still levels can't do at all. And that's why people use commercial OSs. And all I'm going to conclude by saying, because I'm sort of coming to the end, is that Linux, as I've described, isn't going to be off the shelf sorry, I've gone one too far there, isn't going to be off-the-shelf CRA compliant, whereas, as we've already said, a commercial OS has to be. So that's just something that changes the balance that you might want to think about. Just quickly to end in the last minute, how can Direct Insight help you? Well, we're working hard to ensure we offer CRA compliant products. We're offering system on module solutions, which where we're working hard to make sure all those features that I've described are available. We're offering technical training on CRA. Get the flyer on June the 19th. If you're wondering where to start, have a chat. We're happy to do that. You can sign up for my blog. Back of my business card's down there. A blog talks about CRA quite a lot. Thank you. That's a lovely place where we are this year. It's sheep, not flax, but if you come to the training, that's likely where we'll be holding it. And that's it, really. It says questions and answers, but I sort of run out of time, really. So I'll be very happy to talk to you. Stand K9, just come and ask me questions. But we won't pass the mic around or anything, because I'm dead on time here. So that's it. Thank you very much.